Good evening. We want to thank each one of you for being out here tonight to study from God's Word, to open up His Scriptures, and to see what we can gain from it here as Christians. I want to thank the elders, the men, for giving me the opportunity to get up here and speak before you. It's always an honor and a privilege to get up here and speak before this congregation, to speak before your home congregation, where everybody knows you, but to help them get to heaven, to help them get to that reward, to their destiny, to their true home. And it's always a pleasure to be up here in front of you. Tonight I'm going to look at something a little bit different. Last week when I was at work, sitting there watching the news, one of the officers came into the police department and was like, "Hey, turn on the news." So we turn on the news, and all we see on the news is this mass shooting that's happened in California. They're speculating how many are dead. It's just recently happened, maybe 30, 45 minutes. And the officer knows people that are there in California. He has some relationships. He has some connections there. So he's concerned about their well-being. Well, about an hour after the shooting, maybe 2 hours after the shooting, the news starts showing all these pictures of Facebook posting, Twitter posting, Instagram postings of the shooting. And they focused on, why does God let this happen? Why did God let this tragedy strike? And that's where I want to focus our attention tonight, is why does God let bad things happen to good people? Why does God, this all-merciful God who is so loving and compassionate to us, why would He let us suffer? Why does He let those good people, those innocent human beings suffer? It's something that's puzzled my mind, and it's something that's perplexed the minds of many. When we have world wars, when we have mass shootings, when we have Syrians killing Christians, the growing up of ISIS with them on the rise, so many Christians and so many people within the past century or so have asked the question, why? Why, God? Why do this to us? What have we done to you? And it's not only a problem that we have faced within the past century or so, but it's something that has perplexed the mind since the beginning of time. The Greek philosophers have tested this, or have tried to come up with theories about this. But people want to know is, if God's in control, as we read about in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, why would He let this happen? Romans chapter 13, verse 1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. So if God is in control, and God is all this power, then why is He letting these things happen to us? And that's where that news broadcast station focused on, was those postings and those Christians and those atheists, their questions about that. The Greek philosopher wrote, either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or He can but does not want to. If He wants to but He cannot, He is impotent. If He can but does not want to, He is wicked. If God can abolish evil and God really wants to do it, why is there evil in the world? And that's something that we need to be able to ask. That's something that we need to be able to defend against. Why does God let bad things happen to human beings? Why does God allow bad things to happen? And this is how we often feel. Look over at Psalm chapter 44. Psalm 44. If you'll bear with me for just a minute, I'm going to read this whole passage. Psalm chapter 44, beginning in verse 1. O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us the work that Thou didst in their days, in the days of old. Thou with Thine own hand didst drive out the nations. Then Thou didst plant them. Thou didst afflict the peoples. Then Thou didst spread them abroad. For by their own sword they did not possess the land, and their own arm did not save them. But the right hand of Thy arm, and the light of Thy presence, for Thou didst favor them. Thou art my King, O God. Command victories for Jacob. Through Thee we will push back our adversaries. Through thy name we will trample down those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, nor will my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our adversaries, and thou hast put to shame those who hate us. In God we have boasted all day long, and we will give thanks to thy name forever. Yet thou hast rejected us and brought us to dishonor, and thou dost not go out with the armies. Thou dost cause us to turn back from the adversary, and those who hate us have taken spoil for themselves. Thou dost give us as sheep to be eaten, and hast scattered us among the nations. Thou dost sell thy people cheaply, and hast not profited by their sale. Thou dost make us a reproach to our neighbors, and a scoffing and a derision to those around us. Thou dost make us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. All day long my dishonor is before me, and my humiliation has overwhelmed me. Because of the voice of him who reproaches and reviles, because of the presence of the enemy and the avenger, all this has come upon us. But we have not forgotten thee, and we have not dealt falsely with thy covenant. Our heart has not turned back, and our steps have not deviated from thy way. Yet thou hast crushed us in the place of the jackals, and covered us with the shadow of death. If we have forgotten thy name of our God, or extended our hands to a strange God, would not God find this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. But for thy sake we are killed all day long. We are considered as sheep that have been slaughtered. Arouse thyself. Why dost thou sleep, O Lord? Awake. Do not reject us forever. Why dost thou hide thy face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul has sunk down into the dust. Our body cleaves to the earth. Rise up, be our help, and redeem us for the sake of thy loving kindness. That is some powerful words from the psalmist, with real deep meaning of suffering and pain. God, we've done everything you've asked. We've not forsaken your name. We haven't dealt falsely with your covenant. We've obeyed you. Why are you causing us to suffer? Why are you causing the armies to destroy us? And this is how we often feel. This is how we often approach God. God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to them? And the only way that we can understand this is to take a look at a couple examples. Take a look at people who have suffered, Christians that have suffered, and try to figure out why we suffer. Why does Jesus say that I'm going to suffer? He doesn't say that if you suffer. Jesus says that you will suffer. Turn over to John 16 and verse 33. John 16 and verse 33. John 16, beginning in verse 33, says, These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In this world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. We are going to have tribulation. We are going to suffer. Christ has warned that. And not only does he warn us here, but he warns us in other places that we will suffer. And we always ask why. The first person that we see about suffering would be Job. And that's the one I want to first take a look at, is that person, Job. Job suffered greatly and immensely. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Job 1, verses 1 through 5. Job 1, verses 1 through 5 says, There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. And his sons used to go and hold the feast in the house of each one on his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it came about, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, that Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and crushed God in their heart. Thus Job did continually. We see that Job is a blameless, he is an upright man who fears the Lord and does his will. We see him offering sacrifices. He's considered one of the greatest men of the East at the time. He's blameless, he's upright, he fears the Lord, but yet his wealth, his family are all taken away from him. Why? Why is all this taken away from him? He was such a good man. He, out of all the people, should be the ones asking, why me, God? Go ahead and look at verses 13 through 19. Now it happened on that day when the sons and his daughters were eating and drinking with their oldest brothers in the house, that a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came to him and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them, slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Talk about a bad day right there. Whether this all happened simultaneously or spread out, I'm not sure. But to have all this wealth, all this family, all these people that were your servants, have it all just taken away from you. Why? But one thing that we notice about Job is he doesn't blame God for it. Job doesn't say, God, why me? Why are you doing this to me? Instead, he exalts God. Look at Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose and tore his robes and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Out of all the people who had the most opportunity to blame God, who suffered some horrific things, he had probably the most right to ask God why, to blame God for this, but he doesn't. We also see the suffering. We also realize that Job realized that he still had to rely on God. 1 Peter 5, verse 7 says, cast all your anxiety unto him because he cares for you. He cares for you and I. And that's what Job did. He worshiped God. Job realized that, hey, you're the one that blessed me with this, and you're the one that can take it away. I don't have a right to these things. I'm not the one who created these things. You, God, have that right. We also see the Apostle Paul, who suffered greatly. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Second Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9. Starting in verse 8, it says, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Paul, this great apostle that we look up to today, is perplexed. He suffers. He is in despair. He is persecuted, just like we are. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 through 23 says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so. Paul, this devout Christian, this devout Jew at one point, who was doing everything he could, who in his conscience did everything right in his eyes towards God, he suffered. We see the suffering of Paul there in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Corinthians 11, verses 22 through 31. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if in saying, I more so. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have slept in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys in dangers of rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the cities, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and in thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is daily pressure upon me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without me being weak? Who was led into sin without my intense concern? If I have to boast, I will boast of that which pertains to my weakness. Paul does the same thing right here that Job did. He doesn't blame God for this. Yeah, he tells us all the things that he suffered, and he's not complaining about them. He says, I'm going to boast in the one. He says, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. I'm going to boast in God. But why not blame God? That seems like the common conclusion that people have today. It's God's fault that all this is happening. It's God's fault that I'm suffering. The reason that it's not God's fault is Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. Everything that God has created was for good. God gave us free will, and we went and abused it. God gave us free will, and we allowed sin to enter into this world. And that is what causes us to suffer, is sin. God did not create evil. He created the potential for evil by giving us free will, but God did not in and of Himself create evil. He gave us free will because He didn't want these robots just walking around with saying, I love you, and doing whatever He says. God created everything because He wanted genuine love. He wanted genuine commitment of us as Christians. And because of sin that entered into this world, we now have to suffer. Genesis chapter 3, that verse sin that ever happened, we see that that's when things get hard. Adam and Eve were in this paradise with no pain, no suffering. It's not talking about there's no death from what we can read about. But once they eat of that tree and commit sin, that is when the thorns and the thistles come. That is when suffering comes into this world. Statistics show that there's enough food in this world to feed every human being on this earth at least 3,000 calories a day, with food to be left over. It's not God's fault that there's famine. It's not God's fault that people are starving out there. It is the problem of sin. God has blessed us abundantly. God has given us immense and abundant riches, yet we abuse them for our own personal pleasure. We also see that Joseph suffers. If you remember the story of Joseph in the coat of many colors, his father loved him so much that he gives his son, one of the 12 sons, this coat of many colors. And well, his brothers don't take too kindly to that. They don't like Joseph anymore. Well, he's the favorite son. Joseph is sold into slavery. Genesis chapter 37, verse 26 through 28. He's put in prison based on a lie. Genesis 39, verses 19 through 20. And he's forgotten about and left in prison. Genesis chapter 40, verse 23. Joseph was a good man. He never did anything wrong from what we can tell, from what we can read about. He didn't do anything wrong in this time. In fact, he continued to pray to the Lord. He continued to thank the Lord for all that He had done for him. He continued to worship God. But through all this, God was still working in Joseph's favor. Even though he was cast into slavery, even though he was put into prison, even though he was forgotten about, God was still working for good in Joseph's life. Look at Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39, verse 21. Genesis 39, verse 21. Verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of these chief and jailer." God extended His hand to Joseph and did good for Joseph. He extended His kindness to him and good favor. But the Lord was with Joseph. Even though he was suffering, even though he was going through these troubles and these tribulations, God was still with him. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, the last thing that Joseph says before he passes away is, and he says this to his brothers, is, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph had the right mind. Even though my brothers threw me into prison, plotted to kill me, even though they sold me into slavery, God meant it for good. God saved thousands of people from a famine because of Joseph. Even though he was put in a bad situation, God still worked through Joseph. And God can achieve the best outcome from the worst possible situations. Well, you say, God can't help me in this situation. God can't do anything about this situation right here. There's no good that can come from it. God knows what we are going through because He has been through it Himself, through His Son, Jesus Christ. The message to the 7 churches, one thing that Jesus stresses to those 7 churches there in Asia Minor is, I know. I know your deeds. I know your tribulations. I know. He states it over and over and over again there in chapters 2 and chapters 3 of Revelation. Christ knows everything that we are going through, no matter what it is. And He is there for us. He is there for us to cast all of our anxieties, all of our worries, all of our tribulations on Him, because He can sympathize with us as Christians. He knows about the heroes of faith that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11. He knows of Abraham, Moses, Sarah, of all the prophets, of Barak. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 through 40 gives us the people who were not named, though. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 through 40 states, "And what more shall I say? For the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword from weakness, were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received back their dead from resurrection. And others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings, scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and in holes in the ground. And all these things, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect." These men of faith, you see the sufferings that they went through. You see all the things that they had to go through, all the sufferings that we have to go through. And Christ knows. He knows the things that you're going through. And these are people who the world wasn't even worthy to know. Think of all the examples throughout history of good, faithful men and women who followed Christ, who obeyed Christ, yet they suffered greatly. There's a preacher I know who him and his wife had a baby, or were expecting a baby. He showed tremendous faith through it. They knew during the pregnancy that the baby wasn't going to make it. The baby was going to be born and probably had about a week or two left. One of the things that he posted afterwards is, he said that I don't care that my son has died. Yes, I am grieved. Yes, I am sad by it. But I know he's in a better place. He gets to see the Lord. He doesn't have to suffer tribulation anymore. That right there shows tremendous faith in God. He didn't want his son to have to suffer the things. Yes, he wanted to spend time with his son. He wanted to see him grow up. But he knew that he is in a better place now. And the amount of faith that he showed in that just put me in awe. And throughout the whole entire pregnancy, he was posting things daily about God. He was praising God throughout the whole thing. He was a man of true faith. Maybe we suffer here on earth so that we don't take for granted the things that lie ahead of us. Maybe we suffer here on earth so that we don't take for granted our true home. Because this world is not our home. This world is not my home. I'm going to be out of all this pain and all this tribulation one day. I'm not going to have to suffer one day. I'm not going to have to face death anymore. And that is something that we need to look forward to. Christ made the ultimate sacrifice. One of the most awful things that we can read about, God offering His only Son to save those who have treated Him poorly. But yet He made the best possible outcome from it. He gives us a hope of no pain, of no suffering. He gives us that hope as Christians of no more death, no more sorrow. He will wipe away every single tear from their eyes. We won't have need for canes. We won't have need for hospitals, medication, or anything like that. Everything will be taken care of. But because of the sin that we have gone through, the sins that we have committed, because we know in Romans that everyone has sinned and falls short of the glory of God, because of all that, we suffer here on earth. But He is going to wipe away every tear from their eye. I don't have all the answers. I don't claim to have all the answers. I don't know why we suffer, to be honest with you. I can speculate the things why we suffer. I can speculate why we have to go through things. But God's ultimate answer to suffering isn't always an explanation. It's the incarnation. It is His Son who lived here on earth, who died for our sins. Suffering is a personal problem. It demands a personal response. And God isn't some distant or detached or even disinterested being or disinterested deity. He entered into our world and personally experienced everything that we've had to suffer. Jesus is there in our lowest places. He was there for us in our lives. Ask yourself this question: are you broken? Because He was broken like bread for us. Do you cry out that you can't take this anymore? Because He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest of grief. Did someone betray you because he was sold out for money? Are your most tender relationships broken? He was loved and he was rejected. Did people turn from you? They hid their faces from Him like he was a leper. Does He descend into all the deepest fears and troubles that we suffer? Yes, He does. Because no matter how deep our darkness is, He is deeper still. No matter what we are going through, no matter what we have suffered, no matter all the tribulations that we are going through right now, He has gone through so much more for us. And that is God's answer to suffering. That is why we as Christians suffer. I certainly don't want to minimize the pain and the suffering, but it helps if we take a long-term perspective on the things that we suffer. Our ways are not God's ways. His ways are higher than our ways. But one thing I know is He has a plan for each one of us. He has a plan for you and I. And that plan is heaven. Even though we can't see the good that's going to come from our trials and tribulations right now, in the long term, we'll be able to see it. Even though the apostles didn't see why Jesus had to suffer and die at that point in time, even though they didn't understand why He kept telling them over and over again, I am going to die, they eventually, in the long term, saw why He was going to have to suffer. Even though they did not see it in that exact moment, even though they did not see it right then, ultimately, they learned why He had to suffer and why He had to die. I was driving back to the place I was staying there in Kentucky from a gospel meeting. And when I was up in Kentucky, I had to drive back home, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it just starts pouring. Rain's coming down. I have my windshield wipers on as high as they'll go, going as fast as they can go. I'm on the interstate doing about 70 and have to slow down to about 20. I can't see 10 feet in front of me. I can't see the road in front of me. That's what suffering is. Even though we can't see right now the 10 feet in front of us of why we're having to suffer right now, in the long run, after we get to our destination, we're going to see. We're going to see why we had to go through the things we went through. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. Second Corinthians 4, verse 17 says, for momentary light affliction, and remember, this is Paul speaking here, and remember all those things that he suffered? All the beatings, the shipwrecks, the endangerments, how he was left without clothing, left in the cold, how he was hungry and thirsty. He says, momentary light afflictions. The things that we suffer are just temporary. But the things that we're going to see in the long run, and the things that we can expect in the long run, are eternal. Paul also wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, I consider the present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us in that day. It's not just that God knows and sympathizes with your troubles. It's not just that God knows everything about us, that He's sitting there listening to us, but He has experienced it. After all, a close friend of yours can sit there and listen to you cry about your sorrows and pain. Any close friend can sit beside you and comfort you and can empathize with you, but Jesus is much closer than that. He's your closest friend, because if you've put your trust in Him, then He is in you. He cries the tears that He has those tears that you cry. You can lay all of your anxiety, all of your worries, and all of your cares on Him. And therefore your sufferings are His sufferings, and your sorrows are His sorrows. So when tragedy strikes, as it will, as we've already been warned, when sufferings come, as it will, as we've been warned, when you're wrestling with pains, as you will, and when you make the choice to run into His arms, you're going to discover that you'll find peace to deal with anything that you're going through. You'll find peace with the present. You'll find courage to deal with your future. And you'll find the incredible promise of eternal life in heaven. Heaven will surely be worth it all. And that's the message that I want to bring to you tonight. We suffer here on earth. I don't know why it happens. I can't give you all the answers. But I know that compared to heaven, all these sufferings aren't going to be worth a thing. An eternity of no pain, of no sorrow, no more hospitals, no medication, no more death, no more losing loved ones. Heaven will surely be worth it all. And maybe we suffer so that we don't take for granted our destiny, our home, heaven. If you have not committed your life to Him and become a Christian, you don't have that hope. You don't have that promise of heaven. And what a shame it is. I don't know why God does the things that He does, even though He is in control, and I believe that He is in control. I don't know why we suffer. We read in the book of Revelation over and over again all the sufferings that the churches had to face. But one thing that strikes me as interesting is the plagues that He brings on the Romans there in Revelation. He causes nations to rise up, and He causes them to fall. I don't know why we suffer. But all I can certainly tell you with sure certainty is that it's going to be worth it when we get to heaven. All the sufferings, all the pain, all the struggles that we have faced here on earth, they're going to be worth it. And Christ suffered the ultimate test. He suffered the greatest. He died. He received those lashes for us. He took that crown of thorns for us. He was nailed to a cross for us, so that we could maintain that hope of heaven, so that we could gain that hope of heaven. If there are any of you who have heard the word tonight and want to be baptized and have that hope of no more pain, no more suffering, you need to make a commitment to Him tonight. You need to be baptized in Him tonight. Or if you're already a Christian and a believer in Him, and you need to make corrections in your life, you've allowed sin to enter into your life, then you need to make that correction tonight, because you don't know when that time is too late. You don't know when this world is going to end, when your time is up. If there are any here who need to make that commitment tonight, then you need to do so right now. Why delay any longer when that waits for us? When heaven waits for us? If there's anyone here who needs to make that change tonight, please come forward as we stand and sing.